In our previous video, we talked about international non-governmental organizations and transnational advocacy networks, which generally conceive of themselves as out there in the world to do good. And now we're going to consider a completely different kind of actor that's very important in the world, which is multinational corporations, transnational corporations, whose role in the world, right, is defined primarily, of course, to make money. But of course, they probably like to think they're doing good as well, and maybe sometimes they are. So first of all, terminology. MNC stands for multinational corporation. TNC stands for transnational corporation. They mean the same thing. Transnational corporation is just a slightly newer term, kind of more in vogue recently, and that's the term I'm going to use, or I'll try to use through the rest of this discussion. But there's no meaningful distinction. So what's a TNC? It's a business that has operations in more than one country, right? Not merely exporting or importing, but employing people and having operations in multiple countries. Now, many TNCs are quite small. There are a lot of local businesses here in Southern California, right, that might be going back and forth and employing some people across the border in Mexico or something like that. Technically, those are transnational corporations. What we're really talking about in general, though, are large companies with significant operations in many countries, not just a few. And those, because they're big and because they have operations in many countries, they can do some things that other kinds of actors can't. So why do they matter in international politics? Well, for example, they can lobby multiple governments in the same time in the same direction, right? So rather than just trying to get one government to do something, they could be pushing different governments towards some agreement with each other, or to try to homogenize global agreements in a way that serves the interests of the companies and so on. In some cases, by straddling multiple states, they have options to play off one state against the other, right? A sort of classic example that we see between the U.S. and Mexico is companies potentially threatening that if taxes or regulation increase in one place, they'll move jobs somewhere else, and politicians don't like that. They can also use what's called transfer pricing to reduce their tax payments, and in a way not only put pressure on governments to reduce taxes, but also make it hard for governments to tax these corporations effectively. So really having either a negative impact on government revenue, or effectively pushing taxation onto other actors like you and me. And I'll give you an example of that. So transfer pricing. The real global champion of transfer pricing is our friend Apple. Apple, it just so happens that Ireland has a very low tax on corporate profits. That's just the way their tax system is set up. And part of it is to attract companies like Apple. So Apple has a division called Apple Sales International that basically books Apple sales around the world through Ireland, regardless of where the goods are being made and sold. And by having those sales go through the jurisdiction where the tax rate is the lowest, that reduces Apple's tax payments, right? And it shifts those tax payments to Ireland at the expense of other states, right? So Ireland liked this because even though it pushes the overall tax rate down, by pulling in all Apple's revenue and getting it booked in Ireland, it still is making money on the deal. It's pretty clever stuff. Ultimately, the EU found it to be illegal, and there's now sort of a battle underway to see exactly how this is going to work out. But let me give you a hypothetical example. So supposing Apple makes a phone in China that costs $200 in labor and materials to make, which is actually probably more than it really costs. And it's going to sell the thing in Italy for $800. Italy's a member of the EU. And the question, so there's $600 profit there. How much does that get taxed? Well, how much it gets taxed depends on where it gets taxed, because different countries have different tax rates for different things. So if you're Apple, you want the $600 profit to show up in the place with the lowest tax rate, which happens to be Ireland. So here's how you do it, right? You make it in China for $200. You, at least on paper, right? Phones probably just go straight to Italy, but at least on paper, the phone gets bought by Apple Sales International Ireland for $201, right? So there's not much profit in China. Apple Sales International in Ireland then sells it to Apple in Italy for $799, and it gets sold in Italy for 800. So there's only $1 profit in China that gets taxed at the higher Chinese rate, and there's only $1 profit in Italy on it. Now you can see there's a mistake in the slide here. I apologize for that. But anyhow, so China and Italy both basically get paid taxes on $1 of profit, while Ireland, right, gets paid taxes on $598, which, even though their rate is lower, turns out to be a lot of money, but also saves literally billions of dollars for Apple. And so this can be done, of course, with cars or steel, anything in which multiple divisions of a company are moving products across borders. You can always use internal pricing, or what's called transfer pricing, to make the profit show up in the place with the lowest tax rate. And of course, governments around the world hate this. So it's one way in which not only do these companies have power and to get revenue or avoid taxation, but that actually puts a lot of pressure on government to change their tax policies. To what other extent can transnational corporations shape government policy? Well, all companies lobby governments. But what happens when it's a big global corporation with a ton of money lobbying a small, poor government, right? There's maybe more power in the company in some of these cases than there is in the government. And that doesn't even get into the question of what happens when the company actually just flat out bribes people in the government, which is illegal under U.S. law, but it's not illegal under every country's law, and even U.S. firms, I don't think we should assume, always follow that law. So this question comes up: do they have too much power? Right? Can a transnational corporation with power in one country, based, for example, in the United States, get that state to act on its behalf out there in other countries? Right? The classic example from the past is the U.S. really getting involved in overthrowing governments in Latin America because those governments were doing things that were injuring the interests of particular U.S. companies. An example that goes on right up till now is that the big American aircraft companies, Boeing, for example, but other big American companies as well, really rely on the U.S. government to try to lobby other governments around the world to buy Boeing aircraft, for example. So there's a sort of a tight connection sometimes between diplomacy and sales. So there is, on the one hand, there's a lot of anxiety about transnational corporations because they do seem to have such power. But at the same time, governments are still eager to host them. And if you ask why, it's because of jobs, right? One of the biggest goals of governments, right, is to increase employment in their jurisdictions. All politicians want to bring jobs to their jurisdictions. And, that's important not only because it makes voters happy if you actually have elections, but it also increases tax revenue in most cases. And so despite the worries about transnational corporations, governments are still quite eager to host them, and that too gives transnational corporations power, right? They say we'll only build our factory in your place if you, do all these things to improve your infrastructure at your own expense. So one of the big questions is how much power do they really have? There's a famous book that's called Sovereignty at Bay. And the thesis of the book essentially was that state sovereignty is becoming a thing of the past because transnational corporations have so much power. That book was published in 1968, so that's over 50 years ago now. And I think in much of the intervening period, what we've seen is that the nation state actually has endured and in some case expanded its power. I think we're now seeing this question raised again when you have some of these global tech giants like Google, like Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and some others that are accumulating so much money and are operating all over the world. There's this question again as to can governments really bring them under control? And so this is a really interesting question for the future.